Imagine spending almost 10 years building the core code of a tech empire, only to be thrown out by a new CEO in a $3,000 vest. He thought firing me would clear the path for a merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He forgot one priceless detail. He did not fire a regular employee. He fired the gatekeeper, and I will gladly let him lock himself out before handing him the ransom bill. Hello to all our wonderful listeners of the Boss Revenge Stories channel. We sincerely appreciate your time and presence here today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization features, leaving us without the operational budget needed to keep bringing you these thrilling narratives. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community to hear exclusive, real-world stories that are even more intense, much longer, and packed with detailed situations we simply cannot publish on YouTube, all brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors within the same episode. You can easily join us by scanning the QR code displayed on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link found in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's tale of corporate justice, told through the eyes of our main character, Allison Hayes. The digital clock on my secondary monitor clicked to exactly 10 in the morning on a Tuesday at the Helios Peak Innovations headquarters in Austin, Texas. The sprawling, open-plan office was a chaotic symphony of productivity, filled with the rapid, aggressive clicking of high-end mechanical keyboards and the low hum of heavy server racks cooling in the background. We had 50 software engineers packed into a massive space with absolutely no walls. A trendy design choice, supposedly meant to foster collaboration and transparency, but which in reality just created an environment of constant surveillance, zero privacy, and overwhelming sensory overload. The air always smelled faintly of burnt espresso and stressed sweat, a signature scent of the modern American tech industry. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors to the main floor swung open, and the ambient noise began to die down. Bryce Sterling, the newly installed chief executive officer chosen by an out-of-touch board of directors desperate for quick profits, strode into the center of the room. He wore his signature $3,000 puffer vest over a crisp, custom-tailored designer dress shirt, radiating the toxic, unchecked confidence of a man who had never actually built a single working product from scratch in his entire privileged life. He stopped right in the middle of the floor, clapped his hands together loudly to demand immediate silence, and began to announce his grand vision for what he called a dynamic personnel restructuring phase for our company. He did not just make a general, company-wide announcement. He had a specific target in mind, and he desperately wanted a captive audience. Bryce deliberately marched straight toward my desk, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished concrete aisles. The air in the room grew instantly heavy and thick with anticipation. He stood towering over my workstation, ensuring his chest was puffed out and his voice boomed loud enough for every single one of those 50 engineers to hear him crystal clear. Allison, manual coding is a thing of the past. We need more flexible AI minds. You are obsolete. The entire office plunged into a suffocating, terrifying silence. The relentless, rhythmic clatter of 50 keyboards ceased abruptly, leaving a void so quiet, my ears actually rang. It felt as though every single person in the room had simultaneously stopped breathing. Somewhere to my right, a terrified young intern lost his grip on his heavy Yeti coffee mug. It hit the thin industrial carpet with a dull, heavy thud, splashing iced brown liquid all over his sneakers and the floor. But the kid was so utterly frozen in fear that he did not even dare to bend down and pick it up. No one moved a single muscle. They all just stared at their monitors, waiting for the violent explosion they assumed was coming. Bryce reached into the inner breast pocket of his vest and tossed a bleak, gray envelope from the Human Resources Department directly onto my desk. It slid across the smooth surface and stopped right against my keyboard. He flashed a half smile, a perfectly practiced, arrogant smirk that embodied the absolute worst traits of a phony tech bro who read too many startup biographies. "Security will be waiting for you at the elevator in 15 minutes, he declared smoothly. Clearly expecting a massive scene, He wanted me to beg for my job, to cry desperately, or to scream in anger so he could justify his aggressive tactics, paint me as an unstable legacy employee, and cement his absolute authority over the remaining terrified staff. He got absolutely none of that. Instead of arguing, pleading, or shedding a single tear, I maintained an expression of complete, chilling calm. I slowly reached for my mouse, methodically saving the complex deployment file I was working on. I hit the keyboard shortcut to lock my screen, watching my dual monitors fade to black. Then, with deliberate slowness, I reached up to the back of my neck and unclasped the company lanyard I had worn every single day for 8 long years. I held the plastic badge dangling in the air for a brief moment, making sure Bryce was watching intently. Then, I let it go, dropping it straight into the metal trash can under my desk. The sharp clatter of the hard plastic hitting the empty bottom echoed loudly in the dead quiet room, completely shattering his expectation of power. His arrogant smirk faltered for just a second, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. I picked up my heavy leather tote bag from the floor and stood up. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders pushed back, looking him dead in the eyes without blinking. A very slight, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of my lips. I stepped away from the desk and began walking toward the exit, my heels clicking confidently on the hard floor. As I brushed past him, I left him with one short, softly spoken wish. Good luck with next week's system update. I did not look back to see his reaction. I just kept walking out the glass doors. I could afford to be polite, because I possessed a massive, earth-shattering piece of information that his heavily guarded human resources database did not contain. He thought he was throwing out out-of-date garbage to clean up his balance sheet, but he had just willingly cut the main power line to his entire tech empire, and I was going to thoroughly enjoy watching him stumble around in the dark. The drive back from the headquarters was entirely silent, devoid of the frantic energy one might expect from a suddenly unemployed professional. I walked into my apartment, a minimalist sanctuary perched high above the bustling city streets. The afternoon sun cast long, sharp geometric shadows across the polished hardwood floor, standing in stark contrast to the chaotic, hyper-illuminated open office I had just escaped. Unlike a typical fired employee, I felt absolutely no urge to immediately crack open my laptop, meticulously update my resume, or frantically scroll through industry job boards. Desperation was a frantic emotion strictly reserved for those who fundamentally lacked leverage. Instead, I walked slowly and purposefully straight toward my vintage wooden bar cart, picked up a heavy crystal decanter, and poured myself a generous, neat measure of aged Kentucky bourbon. The rich amber liquid caught the fading natural light, glowing warmly in the heavy glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the complex, smoky heat spread deep into my chest, firmly grounding me in the quiet reality of the moment. Drink in hand, I moved down the hallway toward the master bedroom. Hidden discreetly behind a large abstract canvas hanging on the far wall lay a heavy steel biometric wall safe. I spun the combination dial methodically, letting the tactile clicks echo in the quiet room. The thick metal door swung open smoothly, revealing a deliberately sparse interior. Past my passport and a neat stack of emergency cash sat one thick, heavily reinforced manila envelope, sealed with fading red wax. I pulled it out, feeling its surprising weight, and carried it back to the mahogany dining table. The official date stamped forcefully across the front cover read November 14th, 2018. This thick stack of paper was not just an archaic administrative record. It was a comprehensive intellectual property escrow agreement, a legal black box forged directly in the desperate fires of near financial ruin. Back in the winter of 2018, our ambitious tech startup was aggressively hemorrhaging capital. The original executive founders had recklessly overextended our credit lines, pushing us mere weeks away from total catastrophic bankruptcy and the absolute liquidation of all physical and digital assets. To save the enterprise from vicious predatory creditors, We had to drastically restructure the entire technological portfolio overnight because my proprietary, highly complex grid coordination algorithm was literally the only viable, revenue-generating asset keeping the corporate lights on. The desperate board of directors practically begged me to formally register the core algorithmic copyright entirely under my personal name. It was a high-stakes legal shield designed to prevent the aggressive investment banks from violently seizing our most valuable intellectual property during foreclosure proceedings. I agreed to shoulder the burden and save the company, but I demanded a ruthless, foolproof insurance policy in return. My private attorney and I drafted a highly specific, utterly ironclad clause buried deep within the 70-page legally binding document. Between us, we affectionately referred to it as the dead man's switch. The underlying legal framework was beautifully elegant, yet devastatingly destructive. The corporate entity was granted an exclusive global commercial license to utilize my power grid algorithm to generate infinite profit, but that golden license was strictly conditional. It remained legally active only as long as I remained a full-time, fully compensated, actively employed staff member. If I ever decided to leave the company voluntarily to pursue other ventures, the commercial license would seamlessly and permanently transfer to the corporate holding company, provided I physically signed a separate, highly specific waiver of transfer to formally relinquish my rights. However, if I was ever forcibly terminated without verifiable, legally defensible just cause, or pushed out the door without my explicit written consent and that critical signature on the transfer waiver, a completely different, apocalyptic protocol would instantly initiate. The lucrative commercial license would automatically and irreversibly evaporate. After a strict grace period of exactly 30 days from the official date and time of my termination, the entire licensing tier would forcibly downgrade across the board. My intricate, multi-million-dollar grid management software would legally become non-commercial open-source material. Anybody in the world, from university students to rival tech firms, could study and use it for free, but absolutely no corporate entity could legally sell it, package it into a service, or use it to generate a single cent of revenue ever again. Bryce Sterling, hopelessly blinded by his own towering, unearned ego, had utterly failed to see this massive landmine buried beneath his expensive designer shoes. He was a deeply superficial man obsessed with vanity metrics, quarterly revenue charts, and the aggressive visual aesthetics of corporate domination. His entire unimaginative management strategy revolved around blindly slashing the experienced payroll, ruthlessly clearing out the brilliant, quiet minds who had actually built the foundational architecture, and rapidly replacing them with his own sycophantic, overpaid loyalists. He possessed the terrifying arrogance of a newly crowned ruler who genuinely believed history began the exact day he took office, because he viewed legacy employees merely as expensive line items to be erased. He never once bothered to instruct his bloated legal department to conduct a thorough due diligence sweep of the founding technical documents from the early startup days. He foolishly assumed that simply because I sat quietly at a desk and typed complex code, the massive corporation inherently owned every single digital keystroke I ever made. He tragically mistook my quiet, professional diligence for weak corporate submission. I took another long sip of the bourbon, feeling the smooth burn gently coat my throat. I ran my fingertips over the raised, embossed legal notary seal on the final page of the contract, feeling the absolute cold certainty of my tactical position. The spacious room grew steadily darker as the sun finally dipped below the city skyline, wrapping the quiet apartment in deep, comforting shadows. I carefully slid the heavy stack of documents back into the manila envelope, resealed the flap tightly, and returned the package to the cold, dark steel safe. I closed the heavy metal door and gave the dial a hard spin, locking his inevitable doom securely away in the dark. I leaned back against the cool wall and let a slow, deeply satisfied smirk spread across my face. The invisible countdown clock had officially started ticking. He had exactly 30 days of blissful, arrogant ignorance left. I was more than happy to stand back in the shadows, perfectly silent, and let him exhaust himself digging a massive, inescapable trench, right up until the very moment I ordered the heavy cement trucks to pour the wet concrete straight over his perfectly styled hair. The very next morning, my personal inbox chimed with a highly confidential email from the Human Resources Department. It contained my official severance package, an insulting offer of a mere 3 months of base salary, completely ignoring my nearly 10 years of dedicated service. Attached to this paltry sum was an incredibly aggressive, wildly overreaching non-disclosure agreement that demanded my absolute silence regarding internal company operations, proprietary workflows, and corporate culture. I read through the dense legal jargon with a fine-toothed comb, searching for the one thing that actually mattered. There was absolutely nothing, not a single syllable, not one stray clause, and definitely no explicit waiver regarding personal intellectual property rights. They were so desperately focused on making sure I could not badmouth their toxic new leadership on the internet that they completely forgot to secure the actual keys to the castle. I electronically signed the document immediately, smiling as I hit the send button. I was more than happy to take their hush money and stay quiet while they unknowingly marched toward a cliff. Over the following week, Bryce rapidly transformed the once productive engineering hub into an insufferable corporate circus. He plastered the sleek glass walls of the hallways with massive, neon-colored vinyl decals screaming utterly meaningless slogans like "Disrupt to Erupt" and "Synergize the Paradigm." He forced the remaining, already overworked engineering teams to abandon their streamlined workflows and adopt a highly gamified, incredibly chaotic project management software platform that prioritized colorful badges and virtual high-fives over actual code deployment. He was obsessed with the aesthetic of innovation rather than the substance of it. To further consolidate his power and enforce his brand of toxic positivity, he unceremoniously fired 4 more veteran software architects. These were the senior engineers who actually understood the foundational logic of our systems, the people who dared to push back against his ridiculous, impossible deadlines. He replaced them with junior developers who were much cheaper, completely inexperienced, and terrifyingly eager to blindly agree with every terrible idea he proposed. However, software architecture is a living, breathing entity. It requires constant, meticulous maintenance and an intimate understanding of its underlying architecture. Without my daily oversight, the delicate, highly complex grid coordination algorithm began to slowly fray at the edges. Minor synchronization errors started popping up in the back-end server logs. Data throughput experienced microscopic hiccups during peak usage hours. Soon, these small bugs compounded into cascading failures, and high-paying enterprise clients began to notice. Furious emails and urgent support tickets flooded the help desk, complaining about noticeable drops in processing speed and erratic resource allocation that cost them real money. When the panicked customer success managers brought these alarming metrics to Bryce during an all-hands meeting, he arrogantly waved them off with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He looked out at the terrified staff, adjusted his expensive vest, and delivered a line so perfectly stupid it sounded rehearsed. "We are simply experiencing the latency of innovation," he declared smoothly, flashing that fake, practiced smile. "When you push the envelope this hard to disrupt the market, there will naturally be some friction. Tell the clients to embrace the pivot." His delusion did not stop at the office doors. He took his grandstanding to LinkedIn, posting lengthy, self-congratulatory essays completely saturated with meaningless business jargon. He started dropping heavy hints to his thousands of followers about an upcoming massive liquidity era for the company, boasting about leveraging core assets to achieve unprecedented market capitalization. It did not take a financial genius to read between the lines. The industry rumors were already swirling rapidly that he was desperately trying to finalize an aggressive acquisition deal with Titanium Dynamics, a massive multi-billion-dollar global defense and energy corporation known for swallowing up smaller, innovative tech firms. Bryce was not trying to build a sustainable tech company. He was trying to slap a fresh coat of cheap paint on a crumbling house just long enough to flip it for a massive, unearned payout that would set him up for life. The remaining top-tier talent in the company quickly realized the ship was sinking rapidly under the weight of his incompetence. The absolute best developers, the ones who had built the company alongside me from the ground up, quietly began handing in their resignations. They could no longer tolerate the daily barrage of meaningless corporate jargon, the impossible demands, the broken software, and the blatant disrespect for basic engineering principles. But Bryce, in his infinite, arrogant wisdom, completely spun this massive brain drain into a positive, triumphant narrative. He confidently told the board of directors that this was a necessary strategic talent purge. He argued passionately that shedding these expensive high-level salaries would make the quarterly financial reports look significantly leaner and much more attractive to the aggressive corporate acquisition team over at Titanium Dynamics. He honestly believed he was trimming the excess fat, totally unaware that he was actually violently carving out the heart, the lungs, and the entire spine of the operation. I did not need to be physically inside the building to watch the disaster unfold. Every single morning, I walked down to a quaint, independently owned coffee shop located directly across the street from the Helios Peak headquarters. I ordered a large, warm oat milk latte, claimed a comfortable leather armchair right by the massive floor-to-ceiling window, and settled in for the daily show. I would sit there for hours, sipping my drink, calmly watching the frantic, stressed-out employees rushing in and out of the glass lobby with terror in their eyes. I watched the emergency vendor vans pull up in a panic as overworked servers inevitably overheated. I enjoyed a brilliant front-row seat to a magnificent, silent pantomime of an empire rotting entirely from the inside out. I watched a fake, overly confident king proudly survey his domain from his corner office, utterly oblivious to the fact that the actual throne he was sitting on was built directly over a massive sinkhole. And I was the one comfortably holding the detonator. Exactly 20 days after my unceremonious departure, the heavy hitters finally arrived. Titanium Dynamics did not mess around when it came to corporate acquisitions of this magnitude. They flew in a notorious, highly aggressive due diligence team straight from Washington, D.C., landing in Austin with one singular purpose to tear Helios Peak apart and examine its insides. This was a terrifying army of ruthless corporate lawyers, forensic accountants, and senior technical auditors. They immediately commandeered the largest glass boardroom on the executive floor, turning it into a fortress of paperwork and encrypted laptops. Their sole job was to flip over every single rock, scrutinize every line of code, review every vendor contract, and ensure their massive defense conglomerate was not buying a fragile house of cards. I had absolutely no intention of engaging in a screaming match or a petty public feud with Bryce. Amateurs let emotion dictate their strategy. Professionals wait for the exact right moment to move their knight on the board. I drove my car to a random, run-down convenience store 3 towns over and paid cash for a cheap, disposable burner phone. Sitting alone in the sterile parking lot under the harsh fluorescent lights, I tracked down the direct contact information for the lead counsel of the Titanium Dynamics acquisition team. Her name was Victoria Vance, a legendary legal shark known for completely dismantling tech startups during high-stakes negotiations. She was exactly the kind of apex predator I needed to trigger my trap. I typed out a single, incredibly precise text message to her private number. I did not include my name, nor did I offer a long, winding explanation that could easily be dismissed as a bitter rant from a disgruntled former employee. The message contained exactly 4 words and a string of digits. Check Appendix 4B. Immediately following that cryptic instruction, I pasted the exact, original copyright registration number for the core power grid algorithm, pulled straight from the official public database of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I hit send, waited for the delivery confirmation, snapped the cheap plastic phone in half, and tossed the broken pieces into 2 separate dumpsters behind the store. While the digital message was making its invisible way through the cellular networks, I was already moving on to the next critical phase of the operation. I sat down in the private mahogany office of my personal attorney, the very same legal mastermind who had originally helped me draft the escrow agreement years ago. We drank black coffee and spent 5 solid hours meticulously drafting a completely new licensing agreement. This was not a standard, friendly corporate contract. This was an instrument of absolute financial destruction. I instructed my lawyer to inject the most ruthless, heavily slanted, and punishing terms we could possibly legally enforce. We demanded massive upfront capital, exorbitant yearly licensing fees, and absolute creative control. We were weaponizing the paper itself, creating a document perfectly primed for the exact moment the entire acquisition deal inevitably collapsed. I wanted Titanium Dynamics backed into a corner so tight they would have absolutely no choice but to sign away their souls to keep the technology breathing. While I was quietly sharpening the blade in the dark, Bryce was busy throwing himself a parade in the broad daylight, completely oblivious to the lethal threat closing in around him. He was spending his evenings hosting incredibly lavish, painfully expensive wine dinners at Austin's most exclusive steakhouses, desperately trying to entertain the senior vice presidents from the purchasing company. I heard through the tight-knit industry grapevine that he was enthusiastically pouring $3,000 bottles of imported Cabernet, loudly boasting across the white linen tables. He confidently assured his wealthy guests that the core proprietary technology of Helios Peak was an absolutely permanent, entirely exclusive corporate asset. He practically swore on his expensive tailored vest that there was zero legal risk, absolutely no outstanding liabilities, and completely clean ownership of the entire intellectual property portfolio. He was putting on a spectacular, blinding show, desperately trying to project the polished image of a visionary titan of industry closing the deal of a lifetime. But he was completely blind to the silent, deadly currents moving rapidly beneath the surface. He had absolutely no idea that my anonymous message had landed directly on Victoria Vance's secure device. He did not possess the foresight to realize that a lawyer of her terrifying caliber would never simply ignore a highly specific, legally formatted tip, while Bryce was drunkenly toasting to his own imaginary genius and counting his unearned millions. Victoria was actively pulling the original patent filings. She was quietly matching the registration numbers, completely bypassing his incompetent human resources department, and reading the fine print of a foundational contract he did not even know existed. The massive legal bomb I had carefully constructed had not just been planted. Victoria Vance had quietly slid it right under Bryce's premium leather chair in the main due diligence boardroom. The timer was rapidly ticking down to 0, and he was currently sitting right on top of the trigger, casually swinging his legs and smiling at the mirror. Day 28 dawned with the heavy, suffocating heat, typical of a late Texas morning. But inside the climate-controlled walls of the Helios Peak headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with a completely different kind of suffocating tension. It was the absolute final hour, the culmination of weeks of grueling audits, endless document reviews, and highly aggressive corporate negotiations had finally arrived at the grand finale. The official closing meeting for the final due diligence phase was set in the most opulent, completely soundproof glass boardroom the executive suite had to offer. It was a massive space designed entirely to project ultimate corporate power, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding, panoramic view of the sprawling city below. Bryce Sterling was practically vibrating with unearned triumph. He had dressed for his own personal coronation, ditching his usual casual tech bro vest for a heavily tailored, custom Italian suit that likely cost significantly more than an entire engineering team made in a full fiscal quarter. Every single hair on his head was perfectly styled, and his teeth gleamed with a predatory, highly practiced smile. He sat arrogantly at the head of the massive, perfectly polished mahogany table, completely prepared to physically sign his name onto a monumental merger contract officially valued at a staggering $400 million. He could practically feel the immense, life-altering wealth heavy in his pockets. The representatives from Titanium Dynamics, a cold, calculating row of sharp, dark suits, sat in perfect formation directly across from him. At the very center of their intimidating lineup sat Victoria Vance, the lead legal counsel. Her expression was entirely unreadable. a flawless, impenetrable mask of professional stone. The heavy leather-bound binder containing the finalized corporate marriage documents was smoothly slid across the reflective surface of the long table, stopping precisely in front of Bryce. A pristine, incredibly expensive gold-plated fountain pen was placed delicately right beside the signature line. The massive room was utterly silent, save for the faint, rhythmic, almost hypnotic hum of the central air conditioning system, pushing cold air down from the ceiling vents. Bryce confidently reached out. His manicured fingers eagerly brushed the cool metal of the pen. He picked it up, smoothly adjusting his grip, completely ready to secure his golden parachute and permanently cement his totally fabricated legacy as a brilliant corporate savior. The sudden, violent sound of Victoria Vance aggressively slamming her thick legal dossier shut echoed through the pristine glass boardroom like a sharp, echoing gunshot. Bryce flinched visibly, his entire body jerking in shock. The solid gold tip of his expensive pen froze just a fraction of an inch above the crisp white paper. The practiced, arrogant smile on his face violently wavered, rapidly morphing into a look of profound, genuine confusion. He slowly looked up, his eyes locking with the terrifying apex predator sitting perfectly still across the table. Victoria did not blink. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the edge of the mahogany table, her voice dropping to a terrifying temperature that could instantly freeze boiling water, cutting straight through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. "Mr. Sterling, where is the commercial copyright transfer document for the core algorithm from Allison Hayes currently located?" For a long, deeply agonizing moment, Bryce just stared at her blankly. His incredibly superficial brain violently struggled to process the unexpected question. He let out a short, highly forced laugh, an incredibly uncomfortable, breathy sound that completely failed to alleviate the sudden, crushing tension dropping heavily onto the room. He waved his empty hand dismissively in the air, trying desperately to project an aura of total, unfazed control. "Victoria, please," he scoffed loudly, flashing that fake, deeply reassuring smile that had successfully fooled countless naive investors in the past. "That is just ancient, totally irrelevant administrative paperwork. Allison Hayes was terminated from this company nearly a month ago. Helios Peak naturally and undeniably owns absolutely everything she created during her tenure here. It is standard corporate policy. There is absolutely no issue regarding her work." Victoria did not smile back. She did not even acknowledge his pathetic, incredibly transparent attempt at deflection. Instead, she slowly reached into her sleek, heavily reinforced leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, firmly bound stack of aged paper with a deliberate, incredibly forceful motion. She slid the copied document directly across the absolute center of the polished mahogany table until it stopped right in front of him. It was the complete 2018 Intellectual Property Escrow Agreement. She leaned over and tapped her perfectly manicured index finger directly onto the heavily highlighted dead man's switch clause. "No, sir," Victoria stated clearly, her powerful tone absolutely devoid of any warmth, patience, or professional mercy. "According to this legally binding, fully notarized document, because she was terminated without verifiable, documented cause, the entire core technology of your company will automatically become free software in exactly 48 hours. What you are currently attempting to sell us is nothing but a completely empty shell." The physical transformation of Bryce Sterling was immediate, terrifying, and entirely catastrophic. The healthy, supremely confident flush of impending victory violently drained from his face in a single second, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifyingly translucent white. He looked exactly as though all the blood in his entire body had suddenly plummeted straight to the floor. His jaw went completely slack, his mouth opening and closing silently as he mimicked a fish violently pulled from the safety of the water. The heavy gold fountain pen slipped entirely from his violently trembling fingers, clattering loudly and pathetically against the hard wooden surface of the table, before rolling away into the center. Panic, completely raw and utterly unadulterated, violently seized his entire body, a thick layer of cold. Terrified sweat instantly erupted across his forehead, completely ruining his perfectly styled appearance. He wildly turned his head, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely frantic, looking desperately toward his own highly paid internal legal team sitting nervously at the far end of the long room. He silently, desperately pleaded with them to intervene, to smoothly explain away this massive, world-ending misunderstanding, to pull a brilliant, saving legal loophole out of thin air and rescue his massive, life-changing payout. He needed them to be the expensive shield he paid them to be. But the heavily compensated, impeccably dressed corporate lawyers of Helios Peak just sat there, completely frozen in absolute shock and horror. They slowly, uniformly bowed their heads, staring intensely at their entirely empty notepads in overwhelming, crushing shame and sheer, unadulterated terror. They had absolutely no legal defense to offer because they had never once been granted access to this top-secret, deeply buried historical file. Bryce had deliberately and arrogantly kept them completely focused on aggressive expansion and rapid restructuring, utterly ignoring the critical foundational architecture of the very empire he was desperately trying to sell. They were entirely defenseless against the brutal, undeniable truth violently laid out before them on the table. The executives from Titanium Dynamics began to silently close their laptops, their faces twisting into expressions of profound disgust at his staggering, catastrophic incompetence. Victoria Vance did not offer him a single, solitary second to recover his shattered composure. She stood up slowly, deliberately buttoning her perfectly tailored suit jacket, a silent, incredibly powerful signal that the massive negotiations were effectively dead and buried. She looked down at Bryce, who was now visibly gasping for air, his custom Italian suit suddenly looking like a completely suffocating straitjacket. Her voice was as sharp, cold, and unforgiving as a freshly honed butcher knife resting directly against his throat. This deal is completely suspended. We absolutely will not buy a company that does not firmly own its own foundational product, unless you can somehow manage to bring Allison Hayes into this exact room and successfully convince her to sign those transfer papers right now. Exactly 1 hour later, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. I walked into the freezing room not as a dismissed subordinate, but as the undeniable architect of their salvation, holding the absolute fate of both massive corporations entirely in my hands. I wore a perfectly tailored, sharp black suit that projected unyielding authority, my posture flawlessly straight. The moment I crossed the threshold, the suffocating tension in the air shifted dramatically. I completely ignored the desperate, wildly panicked, and bloodshot eyes of Bryce Sterling, who looked as though he had aged a full decade in the span of 60 minutes. His custom Italian jacket was discarded over a chair, and his expensive dress shirt was completely soaked with nervous sweat. He practically threw himself across the polished mahogany table toward me, his voice cracking violently as he babbled his pathetic attempt at a negotiation. He desperately stammered out a deeply insulting offer, promising me a $50,000 cash bonus and my old job back if I would just sit down and sign the corporate transfer waiver immediately. I looked at his shaking hands, feeling absolutely no pity, and I laughed out loud. It was a sharp, genuinely amused sound that echoed brightly against the glass walls. Without saying a single word to him, I reached into my leather bag, pulled out my freshly bound new licensing agreement, and tossed it onto the center of the table with a heavy, satisfying thud. I turned my attention entirely to Victoria Vance and the row of silent executives from Titanium Dynamics. My terms were incredibly simple, legally airtight, and completely non-negotiable. Titanium Dynamics would bypass the Helios Peak corporate entity entirely. They would purchase the exclusive perpetual commercial rights to the power grid algorithm directly from me, as an independent entity, for a sum exactly equal to 20% of the total original merger valuation. However, the most surprising, entirely uncompromising condition was buried clearly on the final page of the document. I demanded that Bryce Sterling be stripped of all executive authority and permanently removed from the premises immediately. Furthermore, his lucrative golden parachute, his massive stock options, and his entire severance package were to be completely and permanently canceled under a specific clause citing his gross incompetence in legal risk management and absolute failure of fiduciary duty. Victoria Vance picked up the document, her sharp eyes scanning the precise legal terminology. As she reached the final page, a slow, deeply appreciative smile spread across her face. She recognized the sheer, beautiful ruthlessness of a perfectly executed trap. Without a single moment of hesitation, and without even bothering to throw a passing glance at the ruined man sweating profusely at the end of the table, she firmly nodded her head in absolute agreement. The rest of the titanium executives instantly mirrored her gesture, sealing his fate in total silence. A few moments later, the heavy doors opened again. Two burly corporate security guards stepped into the room. They were the exact same men Bryce had eagerly dispatched to physically escort me out of the building just weeks prior. Now, they walked straight past me, gently but firmly instructing Bryce to hand over his executive keycard and his company laptop. He was completely speechless, his mouth hanging open in silent shock as they flanked him on both sides and marched him out of the glass boardroom. I watched through the transparent walls as he was humiliatingly paraded down the main hallway, marched directly toward the elevator under the intense, deeply satisfied stares of the very same software engineers he had relentlessly oppressed and terrorized. When the room finally cleared, I walked over to the head of the mahogany table. I slowly lowered myself into the warm leather executive chair that he had just forcefully vacated. I poured myself a crystal glass of iced water, took a long, refreshing sip, and picked up the heavy gold fountain pen resting on the polished wood. With a few smooth, deliberate strokes, I signed the bottom of the contract, instantly revaluing my entire life and securing my absolute financial independence. As the ink dried, I realized a profound truth. Sometimes, the absolute sweetest revenge is not violently destroying the company that wronged you. The true victory is seamlessly transforming that very same empire into your own personal asset and forcing your arrogant enemy to walk out the front doors entirely empty-handed. Thank you so much to every single one of you for taking the time to listen to this story today. We would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let us know your location. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider supporting our work by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. Because YouTube has entirely disabled our monetization, your direct support is truly the only way we can keep this channel alive. Over on our Patreon, you will find the absolute best, most intense, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube, featuring much deeper details and incredible situations. You can easily support us by scanning the Patreon QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the direct link provided in the video description or the pinned comment below. Thank you once again for your incredible support, and we will catch you in the next thrilling episode.